10 historic royals you are most likely to be related to. Thank you to AG1 for sponsoring this video. Have you ever felt like you really should be living in a palace? Do diamond-encrusted crowns look particularly fetching on you? And are you darling at waving to adoring crowds from a carriage or balcony? Then you may have wondered if you have a few kings and queens back in your family tree. Today, I will share how you can find out if you have royal blood and introduce you to 10 historic royals with prolific progeny. Wherever you are from in the world, there is an excellent chance that you are related to at least one, if not several of them. Whenever I do a video about royal genealogy, I get a lot of comments from people about their own royal ancestors. I find it so interesting when people are able to dig up their family roots and uncover that they are related to a famous historic figure. But is it particularly rare or special to be related to royalty? In recent years, commercially available DNA tests like MyHeritage, 23andMe, and Ancestry.com have made it easy to learn about your heritage. But while spitting in a vial can tell you if your ancestors were Iranian, Irish, or Iroquois, there is no simple test to reveal if any of them were royal. The only way to find out for sure is to do your own genealogical research. I have done this and found many royals on my own family tree. And while genealogy is a fascinating rabbit warren, it takes tons of time, is full of unexpected twists and turns, fascinating discoveries, and frustrating dead ends. And people who are adopted, whose ancestors were enslaved or forced to migrate, or who come from a country with inconsistent record keeping may have a difficult time building their own family trees. But what if you want to know right now, without hours of slogging through death certificates and census records, if you are related to kings and queens from history? There is a simple, at-home, free test you can take to determine if you have royal blood. All you have to do is answer this question: do you have blood? If the answer is yes, then congratulations, some of it is almost certainly royal. The fact is, there is nothing special about so-called royal blood. Monarchs encourage this myth to justify their own claim to the throne. But unlike money, royal blood has a tendency to trickle down far and wide, to the extent that practically every living person is related to at least one, probably many, royals from history. Modern royal families are rich and famous because, by pure luck, they are the oldest child of the oldest child of the oldest child, going back centuries to a man who was just an ordinary human, but was also the best warlord in his area and managed to conquer his neighbors. And with power and wealth also came women and more opportunities to reproduce. Kings and emperors tended to have a lot more children than the average man, both with their queens, whose primary purpose was to bear heirs, and with their mistresses, concubines, or victims. The heir to the throne nearly always married a princess. In Europe, this tended to be the daughter of another royal family, and in ancient Egypt, pharaohs often married their own sisters. First-string royals became a genetically isolated community, where fresh genes were not welcome. But that doesn't account for each crown prince's younger legitimate siblings, who might have married minor royals or nobles, or their illegitimate half-siblings who often married commoners. It wouldn't be too many generations before a king had peasant great-great-grandchildren. In the simplest terms, the way we calculate how many descendants any person from history has is c to the power of y over g. C is the number of children in each generation. Y is the number of years since that person lived, divided by G, the average length of a generation. So let's imagine a monarch who lived in the year 1524, 500 years ago, with an average generation length of 30 years. Say they had a small family, only 4 children who survived to have children of their own, and each of those children also had an average of 4 children, and so on. That monarch could potentially have over 17 billion descendants alive today. Of course, that's impossible. There are only 8.1 billion people currently alive. but it stands to illustrate the exponential spreading of genes. The problem with this simple formula is that only one of the factors is easy to know exactly: how many years there have been between when a person lived and today. But how many of their children survive to reproduce in each generation varies widely. Some monarchs sired dozens or even hundreds of offspring, but not all of their descendants would have enjoyed the same fecundity, particularly their daughters. And in just a few generations, war, plague, or famine might wipe out huge numbers of their descendants. Likewise, generation length is difficult to determine. Genealogists typically use numbers around 25 or 30 for the average age at which people reproduce. However, through much of history, women had children much younger than their male counterparts. And today, people are having children later and later. Genealogists and statisticians spend their whole careers trying to come up with more accurate formulas for how many descendants a particular historic figure has, and even then, it's only a guess. However, when trying to guess how likely you are to be related to a particular royal from history, this basic formula is quite helpful. Royals who had the right combination of a large brood of children and lived long enough ago that their offspring have had multiple generations to reproduce exponentially can have modern descendants in the millions or even billions. But how do we know that you are almost certainly one of them? It's really just a numbers game, and the math going from you to the royal is much simpler. Whatever your family situation, genetically speaking, you have 2 biological parents, 4 grandparents, and 8 great-grandparents. In each generation, the number of ancestors doubles. You can use the same formula but swap out the C for P, which is always 2. And let's assume generation length is 25 years, so each century has 4 generations. If you were born in 2000, then back in 1900 you had 16 great-great-grandparents. In 1800, you had 256 ancestors. In 1500, you had over 1 million ancestors. And in the year 1000, you had over 1 trillion ancestors. However, in 1000 CE, there were only 275 million people alive on the whole planet. So invariably, tree branches started to fold in on each other. But before you check the mirror for signs of a Habsburg jaw, keep in mind that inbreeding refers to close relatives, like uncles and nieces who share 25% of their DNA, or first cousins who share 12.5%. If you find a 3 times great-grandmother on your father's side who also appears on your mother's side, that would mean your parents are third cousins and share less than 1% of their DNA. So there is plenty of variance to avoid being Carlos II of Spain. The further you go back, exponentially more connections are made and the wider the net of your ancestors is. And invariably, some of those ancestors were royals. This also means that you have more connections with other people living today. According to the prevailing peer-reviewed theory by Yale mathematician Joseph Chang, everyone on Earth has, at some point in history, a common ancestor with every other person on the planet. This is the identical ancestor point. Your IAP with a sibling is 1 generation back. For someone in your hometown, it may be just 3 or 4 generations. For someone in another part of the world, it may be a few hundred years back. But we are all related to one another through common ancestors somewhere in history. MIT statisticians theorize that around the year 55 CE, there was 1 person alive somewhere in the world who is an ancestor to everyone alive today. Go further back to between 2200 and 5300 BCE, and you reach the world genetic isopoint. At this point in history, every human alive who left any surviving descendants, about 80%, is an ancestor to everyone alive today. Each continent and each ethnic group has their own genetic isopoint, which is much closer to today. It is estimated that Europe's isopoint is around the year 1000 CE. So if you have any amount of European ancestry, then any royals who successfully reproduced in Europe at or before the year 1000, and there were a lot, are probably your ancestors. If you're not European, then there are plenty of other royals whom you are probably related to. So let's meet some of these kings and emperors who had the right combination of spreading their genes far and wide and living far enough in the past that their descendants had ample time to reproduce exponentially. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but I've selected royals whom genealogists often focus on and try to get a good spread, so no matter what your heritage, you are probably related to at least one, if not several of them. Even if your ancestors were royal, they likely didn't live very long or healthy lives. The diets of the rich were packed with luxury and unhealthy ingredients, like meat and sugar, while peasants ate more vegetables and greens. If the holiday season has you feeling like Henry VIII, then get your nutrition back on track with AG1. AG1 is so much more than greens. It's a research-backed daily health drink that combines a multivitamin, probiotic, and blend of superfoods into one scoop. One scoop of AG1 per day supports energy, digestive regularity, immune defense, and a healthy mood. A scoop in cold water has become part of my daily routine. I enjoy the refreshing taste of pineapple and vanilla bean. The adaptogens and B vitamins give me a boost of energy without a caffeine crash, and I feel great about the daily dose of antioxidants, probiotics, and functional mushrooms bulking up my immune system for cold and flu season. Go to drinkag1.com/teatime or scan the QR code to save $20 on your first subscription of AG1. And now back to history. Counting down from the smallest to largest number of modern offspring, here are the 10 royals that you are most likely to be related to. Number 10. Ismail Ibn Sharif emerged victorious from wars with his relatives to become Sultan of Morocco in 1672. During his 55-year rule, the Sultanate reached its peak. He built a strong army of enslaved Africans and battled many of his neighbors, including the Spanish and Algerians. He also captured and enslaved many Christians and was feared in Europe as the Blood King. He built diplomatic relations with European royals and was compared to his contemporary, Louis XIV of France, for their shared charisma and authority. Many of the people Ismail enslaved were women. He amassed a harem of over 500 concubines. An Englishwoman named Lala Balquis, who was on her way to Barbados, was captured by Berberi pirates and given to the Sultan as a gift. An Irish woman named Mrs. Shaw suffered the same ordeal, but was rescued by the British consulate. According to palace records, the women of Ismail's harem gave birth to 525 sons and 343 daughters, a total of 868 children. However, other records indicate there may have been even more. The Guinness Book of Records claims Ismail had 1,042 children and was the most prodigious father in recorded history. While Ismail may have fathered more offspring than any other monarch on our list, save one, because he lived only 300 years ago, his abundant progeny has not had as much time to spread. However, if you have heritage from the Middle East, Southern Europe, and especially North Africa, then there is a decent chance that you are among his estimated 5 million living descendants. 9. Atahualpa was the last ruler of the vast Inca Empire, which spanned along the western coast of South America from modern-day Ecuador through Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. Atahualpa defeated his half-brother to claim the throne in 1532. He had a queen, Coya Asarpe, and a secondary wife, Cuxerame, who gave birth to 10 children. He likely also had children by several concubines. During his brief reign, Spanish conquistadors led by Francisco Pizarro arrived in his empire. They ambushed Atahualpa and put him on trial for murdering his brother and treason against the Spanish crown. He was sentenced to be burned at the stake, but after he agreed to be baptized, he was merely garroted. though Atahualpa's reign was cut short after just 1 year, allowing the Spanish to overtake his empire. His genetic legacy lives on. His progeny may number around 100 million. Upper and middle-class families from South America tend to have more European ancestry. However, genetic and historic researchers have found that humbler families are far more likely to be descended from Atahualpa and other ancient Incan emperors. Number 8. Edward III of England was one of the great warrior kings of the Middle Ages. After the disastrous reign of his father, Edward II, he transformed England back into a great military power. Over the course of his 55-year reign in the 1300s, he battered the French in the Hundred Years' War, but his people were devastated by the Black Plague. Edward also famously founded the Order of the Garter. He and his queen, Philippa of Hainaut, had 8 sons and 5 daughters. And the king had at least 3 illegitimate children with his mistress, Alice Perrers. Edward III is a royal who comes up a lot in the family trees of people with English heritage. He is an ancestor of celebrities including Meghan Markle, Hilary Duff, Jake and Maggie Gyllenhaal, Michael Douglas, Ellen DeGeneres, Laura Dern, Dakota and Elle Fanning, and Johnny Depp. I am also one of Edward's descendants. Brits were all aflutter in 2016 when tough-talking East Ender Danny Dyer appeared on the popular genealogy show Who Do You Think You Are? And discovered that he was a descendant of the medieval king. Danny was pretty surprised, but he shouldn't have been. According to calculations by geneticist Adam Rutherford, Edward III is an ancestor of 99.53% of all living people of British descent. That's about 200 million people worldwide. Anyone who finds a connection to Edward III will also be a descendant of his 5 times great-grandfather. Number 7. William the Conqueror. He was an illegitimate son of the Duke of Normandy, who earned his nickname by invading England in 1066, establishing its modern monarchy and forever changing the kingdom's language and culture. Unusually for a king, William was not recorded to have had any mistresses or fathered illegitimate children. Whatever energy he had after battle, he focused on his wife, Matilda of Flanders, who gave birth to 9 children. Their offspring married into royal houses all over Europe, spreading their father's conquering genes far and wide. Today, every royal in Europe claims descent from William the Conqueror. Therefore, anyone who can claim descent to any European royal, however minor, is also a descendant of William the Conqueror. This includes 57 million people in Britain, plus 200 million worldwide who are of British descent, and tens of millions more of wider European descent. Millions of Americans can count William the Conqueror as one of their ancestors, including every single U.S. president, from George Washington to Joe Biden. Many early American colonists were the younger or illegitimate children of English nobles. They didn't inherit land or titles, but they had just enough wealth to book passage to the New World to seek their fortunes. There they attained higher social status based on their Old World lineage. This goes a long way in explaining the obsession Americans in particular have with pedigree. In the 20th century, genealogist Harold Brooks Baker famously predicted that the presidential candidate with the most royal blood would win each election. He credited cunning and conquest in their DNA, but really it was about coming from a wealthier and more prominent family. However, the most royal candidate theory has been repeatedly disproven. Number 6. Genghis Khan. In the 1200s, the Mongol emperor ravaged China, Russia, and the Silk Road territory, and countless women along the way. He conquered the largest contiguous empire in history, 3 times bigger than Rome. His empress, Bort, delivered 4 sons and 5 daughters. The Khan also had 6 Mongolian wives, and many foreign wives who were the daughters of conquered kings. Mongol soldiers were ordered to bring the most beautiful women they captured to the emperor. It is estimated that Genghis sired between 1,000 and 3,000 offspring, but as records of his victims were not kept as well as those of Ismail Ibn Sharif, the Sultan gets the dubious honor of being the most prolific father in history. After Genghis's death, the empire went to his youngest son, as was traditional at the time. He fathered 40 legitimate descendants, and his son, another famous warrior, Kublai Khan, had 22. For centuries after Genghis's death, rulers in Central Asia needed to be one of his descendants to claim various thrones. A century after his death, a Persian historian estimated that he had about 20,000 descendants. In 2003, researchers found that about 16 million men in Central Asia, or 1 in 8, carry Genghis Khan's Y chromosome. Worldwide, it's 1 in every 200 men. While that seems like a lot, his total number of descendants is actually significantly higher. Because the Y chromosome is passed down from father to son, this figure only accounts for men who have had only male ancestors between them and Genghis Khan. When you add in everyone who had even one female in their lineage back to Khan, the figure jumps into the billions. Genghis Khan was not far enough back in history to live before Asia's genetic isopoint, of which I was not able to find a reliable estimate. So he's probably not an ancestor of every person of Asian descent, but he was unquestionably prolific. Number 5. Charlemagne conquered a vast empire in Central Europe and forced the Pope to crown him Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800. He had a massive influence on European culture, law, and religion, and is often called the Father of Europe. This is true in a very literal sense. While Charlemagne was busy converting pagans to Christianity at sword point, his love life was far from holy. The great emperor had 5 wives. Emaltrude bore him a son before he left her for a political marriage to Desiderata. A year later, the Pope annulled that marriage so he could marry Hildegard. She died giving birth to her 9th child. Next, he married Fastrada, who bore 2 daughters. After her death came a childless marriage to Liutgard. Charlemagne also had at least 4 concubines. Many of his romantic entanglements were going on simultaneously. In total, the emperor had 18 children. 3 of his grandsons fought over his empire and split it up into 3 parts, which eventually became France, Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire. Because Charlemagne left behind so many powerful and wealthy descendants, and because he lived 200 years before the European genetic isopoint, he is believed to be an ancestor of every person alive today who has any amount of European heritage. The continent itself has a population of 750 million, but Europeans have been particularly notorious for spreading their genes through colonization, and it is estimated that about 38% of the world's population, or 3 billion people, are descended from Charlemagne. Number 4. Niall of the 9 Hostages was an Irish king in the 400s. When the Romans abandoned Celtic lands as far too wild to control, Niall and other warlords filled in the power vacuum. According to legend, while raiding in Wales or possibly France, Niall captured and enslaved a Christian and brought him back to Ireland. The man, named Patrick, escaped and spread the Christian faith across the island. Today, St. Patrick is the patron saint of Ireland. Niall got his nickname because when a neighboring prince, Ealhchéad, insulted him, Niall chained him to a stone and sent 9 warriors to execute him. Ealhchéad broke the chains and used them to kill the 9 warriors. The rivals battled, according to legend, across Europe, but probably really just England and Scotland, until Ealhchéad shot Niall with an arrow and killed him. Niall had 2 recorded wives and 8 sons. They carried on his dynasty, which would continue to dominate northwestern Ireland until the English conquest in the 1500s. But the number of his daughters and the numerous children he sired with enslaved women is unknown. However, based on recent genetic studies, it was probably a lot. Researchers at Trinity College Dublin found that 8% of all men in Ireland carry Niall's Y chromosome. That number jumps to 20% in the Northwest. And thanks to Irish immigration to America in the 1800s, 2% of New Yorkers also have Niall's Y chromosome. If your last name is O'Neill, meaning descendant of Niall, then you are probably one of them. This totals about 3 million people, and while that certainly proves Niall and his sons were more prolific breeders than other men of their time, as we learned with Genghis Khan, those with the Y chromosome only account for a small percentage of total descendants. Because Niall lived in the 400s, well before the European genetic isopoint of 1000 CE, he is likely an ancestor of every person of European descent alive today, totaling 3 billion people, or 38% of the world's population. And because his offspring had a 400-year head start, he likely has even more living descendants than Charlemagne. Number 3. Emperor Taizong of Tang was a co-founder of the Tang dynasty of China in the 600s. He consolidated power and oversaw a golden age of peace and prosperity. When he wasn't in the saddle or on the throne, he was in the bedroom. His empress, Zhang gave birth to 7 children. He had 18 high-level concubines whose names were recorded. They presented him with 36 children, and his dozens of unrecorded lower concubines gave him countless more offspring. His son and heir, Guizong, proved ineffective, and his former concubine, Wu Zetian, took over as China's first and only female ruler. Taizong's successful rule and abundant reproduction is compounded by the fact that he lived 1400 years ago, and his offspring have had about 56 generations to multiply. While Taizong is not as notorious as Genghis Khan for his fecundity, because he lived much earlier and therefore closer to Asia's genetic isopoint, he is likely an ancestor of every person of Chinese descent around the world, plus a large percentage of the rest of the population of Asia, roughly 4 billion people. Number 2, Ramses II of Egypt, is widely considered the greatest pharaoh of Egypt's greatest era, the New Kingdom. He ruled in the 1200s BCE and won 14 out of 15 military campaigns. The Battle of Kadesh was a draw. He founded cities and ordered the construction of many great monuments, though he lived 1500 years after the construction of the pyramids. Later pharaohs called Ramses the Great Ancestor, and he lived up to the name. He fathered at least 103 children by 2 consorts, Nefertiri and Isetnofret, and at least 6 lesser wives. Some of his wives may have been his daughters or sisters, but they didn't bear him any children. Because Ramses II lived 3,200 years and over 100 generations ago, it is estimated that the majority of people in Africa, East Asia, and all of Europe, plus those with heritage from those areas, are his descendants. So about 6 billion people worldwide. When Ramses II died, he was buried in a magnificent tomb in the Valley of the Kings. His sarcophagus was discovered in 1881. So if you want to visit your royal 100 times great-grandfather in the flesh, you can see him at the National Museum in Cairo. There is still one more royal from whom potentially every single person in the world is descended. Number 1, Scorpion I of Egypt, is the first monarch in history for whom we have archaeological evidence. He ruled Upper Egypt around 3200 BCE. That's 2,000 years before Ramses. His tomb was discovered in the royal cemetery of Abydos. His mummy and treasures were looted centuries ago, but small ivory plaques marked with hieroglyphics of his name and jars containing wine residue survive to bear witness to his existence. They tell of battles he won and towns he conquered, but give little evidence of consorts or children. However, assuming that he, like most kings, left a few heirs behind, because he lived smack in the middle of the estimated human genetic isopoint between 2200 and 5300 BCE, it is quite possible that Pharaoh Scorpion I is an ancestor of every single person alive today. Are you related to any of the royals on this list, or any other famous figures from history? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and check out my other history videos. You can also join my Patreon to support my work and get early access to all of my multi-part series. Thank you for watching.